Commander Thral'kesh had seen a lot of terrible things in his 247 years of military service. He had watched entire battalions get vaporized by plasma artillery. He had personally pulled his second-in-command out of a collapsing orbital station while half his carapace was melting off. He had even sat through a 3-hour presentation on updated requisition protocols, delivered by an accountant who spoke exclusively in monotone. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for the unholy disaster currently glowing on his datapad screen. "Explain this to me again," he said, his voice carrying the kind of calm that preceded violent explosions. "Slowly, using small words, because I want to make absolutely certain I understand what I am looking at before I start breaking furniture." His 3 administrative assistants, Plex, Vorn, and Tilka, exchanged the kind of glances that species across the galaxy universally recognized as who is going to tell the angry commander he is reading this correctly. Plex, the Valorian, with 6 eyes and an unfortunate stutter when nervous, went first. "Sir, the incoming class roster for Predator Division has been, well, it has been finalized and, transmitted to all relevant departments and—" "Get to the part where my training program becomes a galactic joke," Thral'kesh interrupted, tapping one chitinous claw against the datapad screen. "This part right here, line 47. Tilka, who had survived 4 tours under Thral'kesh's command and therefore had slightly more spine than her colleagues, leaned forward and read aloud. "Recruit Kayla Bennett, species human, age 19 standard cycles, combat rating 2.1. She paused. "Sir, we believe there has been a clerical error in processing." "A clerical error," Thral'kesh repeated slowly, his mandibles clicking together in a way that made all 3 assistants flinch. "A clerical error has placed a human female, barely out of adolescence, with a combat rating that would not qualify her to guard a supply closet, into the most elite training program in the Galactic Coalition. A program designed for species that are born with natural armor, redundant organ systems, and the kind of predatory instincts that make them dangerous before they even learn to walk." "Yes, sir," Vorn squeaked. He was a Plixian, which meant he was already naturally anxious, and right now he looked like he might vibrate straight through the floor. Someone in the processing center clearly transposed the decimal point. It should read 21.0. That would make her, well, actually qualified for preliminary screening at least. 21.0, Thral'kesh said, setting down the datapad with the kind of careful precision that suggested he was actively preventing himself from throwing it through a wall. "So instead of a highly trained human operative with exceptional scores, we have accidentally enrolled someone who is statistically less threatening than a standard-issue ration pack. Technically, sir, ration packs are not rated on the combat scale, so—" "Vorn, stop talking." "Yes, sir. Stopping now, sir." Thral'kesh stood up from his desk, his full 8-foot frame unfolding with the fluid grace of a career soldier who had spent decades training his body into a living weapon. He walked to the window of his office, which overlooked the main training grounds of the Predator Division compound. Somewhere down there, in less than 6 hours, Kayla Bennett was going to show up expecting to start the most brutal military training program in known space. And she was going to die. Probably on day 1. Possibly in the first hour. "Options," he said, still staring out the window. "Give me options before I have to explain to Coalition Command why I let a human child get ripped apart by a Hexian berserker during orientation." Plex cleared his throat. We could contact her directly, inform her of the error, offer her a position in a more appropriate training program. Something with a lower mortality rate, like communications, or logistics. Logistics has a very reasonable survival rate. We could falsify a medical exemption, Tilka suggested. Claim she failed the final health screening. Happens all the time. No one would question it. We could also just, fix the rating in the system, Vorn added helpfully. Change the 2.1 to 21.0. Pretend this never happened. I have the access codes. Thral'kesh turned around slowly, fixing all 3 of them with the kind of stare that had made enemy combatants surrender without a shot being fired. "So your solutions are admit we made a mistake, admit we made a mistake, or commit fraud and still admit we made a mistake. When you phrase it like that, sir, it does sound somewhat less than ideal. Do you know what happens if we admit this error publicly?" Thral'kesh asked, his voice dropping into a growl. "Do you know what every other training division, every competing program, Every smug instructor who has ever been jealous of Predator Division's reputation will say, "Silence." They will say, he continued, that the legendary Predator Division, the program that has produced 12 coalition heroes, 37 decorated officers, and more combat citations than every other training facility combined, cannot even process its own paperwork correctly. They will say we are so incompetent that we accidentally enrolled a human child into a program that kills full-grown warriors. More silence. They will laugh at us. Thral'kesh said quietly. For years, possibly decades. Tilka raised one tentacle tentatively. So what do we do, sir? Thral'kesh looked back down at the datapad. At the file photo of Kayla Bennett staring back at him. She had dark hair pulled into a practical ponytail, brown eyes that looked curious rather than afraid, and a slight smile that suggested she had absolutely no idea what she had signed up for. She was going to quit. Obviously, humans were fragile, emotional, and prone to giving up when things got difficult. She would take one look at the other recruits, realize she was catastrophically out of her depth, and voluntarily withdraw before lunch. Problem solved. No public error, no damaged reputation, no dead human to explain. Nothing, he said finally. We do nothing. Let her show up. Let her see what Predator Division actually is. She will withdraw on her own within an hour, and we will process her exit paperwork quietly. Error corrected, reputation intact. And if she does not quit, sir? Plex asked nervously. Thral'kesh's mandibles curved into something that might have been a smile on a species that smiled. Then I get to watch natural selection do my job for me. Either way, this problem resolves itself by end of day. He picked up the datapad again, approved the roster with a single claw tap, and sent all 3 assistants back to their stations. Somewhere out there, Kayla Bennett was packing her gear, completely unaware that she was about to walk into a training program designed to break species significantly more durable than humans. Thral'kesh almost felt bad for her. Almost. The assembly hall of Predator Division looked exactly like what it was, a deliberate intimidation tactic wrapped in military architecture. 60 feet of reinforced steel walls, lighting designed to cast harsh shadows, and enough space to make individuals feel small and insignificant. Thral'kesh had designed it himself, back when he still believed psychological warfare started before physical training. From his observation deck, positioned 20 feet above the main floor behind one-way armored glass, he had a perfect view of the incoming recruits filtering into formation. And what a formation it was. Zoras, the Hexian berserker, stood nearly 9 feet tall with 4 arms that ended in claws capable of ripping through hull plating. His exoskeleton was naturally armored in overlapping black plates that clicked softly when he moved, like a walking nightmare made of knives. He had already positioned himself at the front of the formation, because Hexians did not understand the concept of subtlety or personal space. Beside him, attempting to maintain a respectful 3 feet of distance, stood Queentar, an assassin from one of the ice worlds in the outer reaches. His species had evolved in sub-zero temperatures, which meant his body temperature ran cold enough to frost the air around him. He wore a thermal regulator suit that hummed quietly, and his eyes, all 4 of them, constantly scanned the room with the paranoid precision of someone trained to expect ambush at any moment. There were others. A Korgathi shock trooper whose skin could harden into living stone. A Valorian sharpshooter with telescopic vision and reflexes fast enough to catch projectiles mid-flight. 2 Drexian twins who communicated telepathically and fought like a single organism with 8 limbs. Every single one of them had been screened, tested, evaluated, and approved based on genetic advantages that made them naturally superior combatants. And then there was Kayla Bennett. She walked in approximately 4 minutes after everyone else had already formed ranks, which meant she was either late or had deliberately waited to make an entrance. Thral'kesh suspected it was the former. Humans were terrible with punctuality. She was wearing standard-issue Predator Division training gear, which had clearly been pulled from stock without any consideration for actual fit. The jacket hung off her shoulders like she was a child playing dress-up in her parents' clothes. The pants were rolled up at the ankles in a way that would have gotten her screamed at by any competent drill instructor. Her boots at least seemed to fit, though she walked with the slightly awkward gait of someone still breaking them in. She was 5 feet and maybe 4 inches tall, perhaps 5'5" if she stood on her toes and lied about it. Her hair was pulled back in the same practical ponytail from her file photo, and she was carrying a standard-issue datapad in one hand and a water container in the other, like she had just walked in from a completely normal day and not into a room full of species that could kill her in approximately 6 different ways before she hit the ground. Thrall noticed her first. All 4 of his eyes swiveled in her direction, his mandibles spreading slightly in what Thral'kesh recognized as predatory interest. The Hexian turned his entire body to face her, which caused 3 other recruits to immediately step back because nobody wanted to be that close to a berserker who was focusing on something. "You are in the wrong facility, small thing," Thrall rumbled, his voice like gravel being dragged across metal. "Civilian processing is in the next building. This is Predator Division." Kayla looked up at him, craning her neck back to make eye contact, which required an almost 90-degree angle. She blinked once, twice, then smiled in a way that Thral'kesh could not quite interpret from his observation deck. "Nope," she said cheerfully, holding up her datapad to show her acceptance documentation. "I am exactly where I am supposed to be. Kayla Bennett, reporting for training." "You must be Thrall. Your file said you held the record for fastest completion of the strength trials last cycle. That is actually really impressive, considering the gravity differential between your home world and the standard testing environment." Thrall's mandibles closed slowly. He tilted his head in a gesture that suggested confusion. You read my file." "I read everyone's file," Kayla said, like this was a completely normal thing to do. "Well, everyone whose records were publicly accessible. Some of you have classified backgrounds, which fair enough. Operational security, and all that." She glanced around the room, making brief eye contact with several other recruits who were now staring at her with expressions ranging from confusion to open hostility. "Quintar, right. Iceworld veteran. 17 confirmed eliminations during the border conflicts. Also, your thermal regulator is leaking coolant from the left shoulder joint. You might want to get that checked before we start running drills." Quintar looked down at his shoulder, where a tiny wisp of vapor was indeed escaping from a loose coupling. He looked back at Kayla with all 4 eyes narrowed in suspicion. Thral'kesh leaned forward against the observation glass, his earlier confidence suddenly feeling less certain. The door at the far end of the assembly hall opened with a pneumatic hiss, and he stepped out onto the elevated platform that overlooked the formation. Immediately every recruit snapped to attention, spines straightened, arms locked to sides, eyes forward. Even Thrall managed something approximating military discipline. Kayla took a moment longer, clearly unfamiliar with the protocol, but eventually figured out the general shape of what everyone else was doing and attempted to mimic it. Her posture was terrible. Her stance was too wide. Her salute was something she had clearly learned from watching historical entertainment vids. Thral'kesh began his speech. The same speech he had given for the last 32 cycles, the one designed to break the weak-willed and terrify the overconfident. "Welcome to Predator Division," he said, his voice amplified through the hall's acoustic system, echoing off the steel walls. "You are here because someone somewhere looked at your genetic profile, your combat scores and your psychological evaluations, and decided you might possibly have the potential to not die immediately in this program." He paused, letting the weight of that sink in. "They were probably wrong," he continued. 60% of you will wash out in the first month. Another 20% will be medically discharged due to injury. The remaining 20% will wish they had quit while they still had the option." Several recruits shifted uncomfortably. Thral'kesh watched their micro-expressions, cataloging who was already questioning their choices. "Predator Division does not produce soldiers," he said, his voice dropping to a growl. "We produce survivors. We produce operators who can function in any environment against any enemy, with any equipment. If you are looking for glory, fame, or an easy path to promotion, you are in the wrong place. This program will strip you down to your base components and rebuild you into something useful, or it will break you. I do not particularly care which." He let the silence stretch, watching the formation. Most recruits were staring straight ahead, trying not to make eye contact. A few were visibly sweating, despite the climate-controlled environment. And Kayla Bennett, 5'4" in boots that did not fit, was writing on her datapad. Thral'kesh stopped mid-sentence. "Recruit, in the back, with the oversized jacket." Kayla looked up, glanced around to confirm he was talking to her, then raised her hand slightly. "Yes, sir. What are you doing?" "Taking notes, sir," she said, Holding up the datapad like this explained everything. You said 60% washout in the first month, 20% medical discharge, 20% wish they had quit. That is 100% total, sir, which I think might be a typo, unless you are using overlapping categories, in which case the statistical breakdown would need clarification for accurate interpretation. The entire assembly hall went silent. Thral'kesh stared at her. You are correcting my mathematics. I am just asking for clarification, sir, Kayla said, still smiling. For my notes, I want to make sure I have accurate data. Somewhere in the formation, someone made a noise that might have been a suppressed laugh. Thral'kesh could not tell who. He looked down at the human, with her terrible posture, and her oversized uniform and her datapad full of notes, and realized with slowly dawning horror that she was not going to quit. Not in the first hour. Possibly not at all. This was going to be a very long training cycle. The Gauntlet had been designed by a committee of sadists, psychopaths, and one engineer who had allegedly been dishonorably discharged for excessive enthusiasm regarding controlled demolitions. It was 3 miles of pure distilled suffering, wrapped in enough safety waivers to fill a small library. Thral'kesh stood in the control room, surrounded by monitor screens that tracked every recruit's vital signs, position and probability of survival. Beside him, Plex was nervously adjusting camera angles while Vorn monitored the automated defense systems, and Tilka kept one tentacle hovering over the emergency medical dispatch button. All recruits are at the starting line, sir, Tilka reported. Vital signs are within normal parameters, accounting for species variance. Threat systems are armed and active. Medical teams are standing by. And our statistical anomaly? Thral'kesh asked, not taking his eyes off the central monitor. Recruit Bennett is stretching, sir, Plex said, adjusting the camera zoom. She appears to be doing some kind of, I do not know, human flexibility ritual. She is touching her toes. Now she is rotating her shoulders. Now she is doing something with her neck that looks medically inadvisable. On screen, Kayla was indeed going through what appeared to be a warm-up routine that would not have looked out of place in a civilian fitness center. Around her, the other recruits were checking weapons, testing armor seals, and engaging in the kind of pre-combat rituals that species across the galaxy use to mentally prepare for violence. She finished her stretches, took a long drink from her water container, and gave a thumbs up to the nearest camera. Thral'kesh felt his mandibles twitch. Is she waving at us? I believe that is a human gesture indicating readiness, sir. Vorn offered helpfully. Launch the trial. Thral'kesh ordered. Let us see how long ready lasts. The starting klaxon blared across the course, a sound specifically calibrated to trigger adrenaline responses in 73% of known species. The recruits exploded forward like a wave of organized chaos. Zur'al took an early lead, his 4 arms pumping, as he charged ahead with the kind of confidence that came from being functionally indestructible. Quintar moved with cold precision, taking a parallel route that avoided the obvious choke points. The Drexian twins split up immediately, covering twice as much ground through their telepathic coordination. Kayla started at a light jog, like she was out for a morning run through a park that did not contain active munitions. First obstacle approaching, Tilka announced. Gravity well activating in 3, 2, 1. The gravity well was a localized field generator that could increase gravitational pull by a factor of 5 in a 300-foot radius. It was designed to simulate combat conditions on high-gravity worlds and also to remind recruits that the universe was fundamentally hostile to their continued existence. Most of the recruits hit the edge of the field and immediately dropped to their knees or flattened entirely, their bodies suddenly weighing 5 times normal mass. Zorro managed to stay upright through sheer muscular defiance, but his forward momentum stopped completely. Quinter went down hard, his thermal regulator suit sparking as it tried to compensate for the sudden stress. Talus hit the gravity field at a full sprint, which should have planted her face first into the ground. Instead, she tucked into a forward roll, used the momentum and increased gravity to launch herself into a tumbling spin, and somehow converted the downward pull into forward velocity. She hit the ground once, twice, 3 times in a series of controlled impacts that looked less like combat maneuvering and more like some kind of acrobatic performance. She cleared the gravity well in approximately 8 seconds, popped back up to her feet and kept running. What? Thral'kesh said slowly. Was that? I do not know, sir. Plex stammered. Rewinding the footage, she used the gravity field as an accelerant, That should not be possible. The mathematics do not support that outcome. The mathematics, Thral'kesh growled, are apparently having the same day I am having. The course continued. Automated turrets rose from concealed positions at the half-mile mark, tracking targets with military-grade targeting systems and firing suppression rounds that hit hard enough to crack exoskeletons. The rounds were non-lethal, technically, but they hurt enough to encourage recruits to take cover seriously. Most recruits dove behind barriers or used their natural armor to absorb hits while advancing. Standard tactical doctrine. Predictable. Safe. Kayla kept running in a straight line directly at the turrets. She is going to get shredded, Vorn said, leaning closer to his monitor. Sir, should we trigger the safety override? Wait, Thral'kesh said, watching closely. The turrets acquired lock. Fired. Kayla juked left, then right, her movements sharp and precise. She was not running evasively. She was dancing. Every 3 steps she shifted direction, always exactly when the turrets recycled their firing sequence. She is counting the delay, Telka said, all 3 eyes wide. The turrets have a 0.3-second recalibration delay between shots. She is timing her movement to the gap in their firing pattern. That delay is built into the system as a safety feature, Thral'kesh said. It is not supposed to be large enough to exploit. Apparently someone forgot to tell her that, sir. Kallus cleared the turret section without taking a single hit, still moving at that same efficient jog. Behind her, Zor-El had finally fought his way through the gravity well, and was charging forward with the kind of rage that suggested his pride had been significantly damaged. Then came the acid pit. The gauntlet included several environmental hazards, and the acid pit was Thral'kesh's personal favorite. It was not actually acid, technically, but a chemical solution that would burn through most organic materials in approximately 45 seconds while triggering every pain receptor in the victim's body. There were safety cables strung across it at irregular intervals. The correct approach was to use the cables to swing across or climb carefully while maintaining 3 points of contact. Zor-El, apparently still furious about being outpaced by a human half his size, did not bother with the cables. He tried to jump the entire 20-foot gap in a single leap. He almost made it. He hit the far edge with his upper 2 arms, claws digging into the reinforced barrier. But his lower body plunged directly into the chemical solution. The sound he made was not quite a scream, but it was close. His lower arms flailed, trying to find purchase, but the edge was too smooth and his grip was slipping. Medical team stand by, Thral'kesh ordered, reaching for the emergency extraction protocol. On the monitor, Kayla had already reversed direction and was sprinting back toward the pit. What is she doing? Plex asked. Something stupid, Thral'kesh muttered. Kayla hit the edge of the pit at a full run, dropped to her knees, and started stripping off her oversized jacket. She tied one sleeve to the safety cable anchor point, tested the knot twice with sharp tugs, then threw the other sleeve down to Zor-El. Grab on, she shouted, her voice barely audible over the course alarms. Come on, upper body day. Let us go. I know you have been skipping leg day for like a century, so use those ridiculous arms and climb. Zor-El, still half submerged in burning chemical solution, stared at her for approximately 2 seconds. Then he grabbed the jacket sleeve with one massive claw and hauled himself upward with enough force that Kayla slid forward 3 feet across the ground, her boots digging trenches in the dirt as she braced against his weight. You are really heavy, she yelled, wrapping the jacket around her forearms and leaning back with her entire body weight. What do they feed you? Depleted uranium. Zor-El got his lower arms onto the ledge, then pushed with enough strength to launch both of them backward. They landed in a heap 5 feet from the pit edge. Kayla pinned under approximately 400 pounds of furious chemically burned Hexian berserker. You are welcome, Kayla wheezed. Also, you are crushing my lungs. Please relocate. Zor-El rolled off her, smoking slightly from the chemical burns on his lower carapace. He stared at her with all 4 eyes. You came back. Why? Because you were going to fail the course if you dissolved, Kayla said, sitting up and examining her ruined jacket with obvious disappointment. And I did not want to be the only one who passed without help. That would have been boring. You are insane, Zor-El said. Yeah, probably. Kayla agreed. Come on. We are losing time. They both got up and kept running. In the control room, Thral'kesh watched Kayla cross the finish line in 3rd place overall, behind Quintar and one of the Drexian twins. Thrall finished 7th, which was still respectable given that he had spent 3 minutes partially submerged in chemical solution. Kayla was bent over, hands on her knees, breathing hard but grinning like she had just won a competition instead of barely survived a military trial designed to break people. Pull her file again, Thral'kesh said quietly. All of it. Everything we have. I want to know who she actually is. Because that was not a 2.1. Plex was already typing frantically. Yes, sir. Right away, sir. Thral'kesh's mandibles hung open slightly as he watched the human recover, still smiling. This was going to be a very, very long training cycle. Day 3 of Predator Division training was traditionally known as the breaking point, which was either a dramatic title chosen by the Psychological Warfare Department or a statistical observation about how many recruits suffered complete mental collapse. Thral'kesh preferred to think of it as both. The sensory deprivation chambers were located in Sublevel 7, buried deep enough underground that no natural light, sound, or environmental stimulus could penetrate. Each chamber was a perfect cube, 10 feet on each side, lined with adaptive projection surfaces that could simulate any environment, any threat, and any psychological trigger the operators chose to deploy. The goal was simple. Identify mental weaknesses before they became fatal liabilities in actual combat. Recruits who broke under controlled torture were better off washing out now than cracking during a live operation and getting their entire unit killed. Most species had predictable fear responses. Hexians feared confinement and helplessness. Ice world predators feared heat and open spaces. Valorians with their compound eyes feared blindness above almost everything else. The psychological profiles were well documented. The trigger scenarios were standardized, and the breaking points were mathematically predictable. Humans, however, were a problem. Her species' psychological profile is incomplete, Tilka said, reviewing the data files for the 3rd time that morning. Most human fear responses are culturally learned rather than genetically hardwired. Heights, enclosed spaces, social rejection, specific animal phobias, existential dread about mortality. The list is extensive and contradictory. So program all of them, Thral'kesh said, entering commands into the chamber control system. Cycle through every documented human fear trigger. If we cannot identify one specific weakness, we will simply attack all of them simultaneously and see what breaks first. Plex made a nervous chittering sound. Sir, that seems potentially excessive. The psychological warfare protocols recommend targeted stimulus rather than broad-spectrum assault. We are supposed to be identifying weaknesses, not creating them. I am aware of the protocols, Thral'kesh said, not looking up from his work. I wrote most of them. This is a special case. Special how, sir? Special in that I am no longer convinced Recruit Bennett's file contains any accurate information whatsoever, Thral'kesh said flatly. Special in that she has now defied statistical probability 3 times in as many days. Special in that I would very much like to understand what I am actually dealing with before she progresses any further into this program. He finished the programming sequence and stepped back, reviewing the scenario parameters one final time. Isolation, darkness, phantom threats that appeared and vanished at random intervals, simulated physical sensations of being pursued, trapped, and hunted. Audio stimulus designed to trigger primal panic responses. Temperature fluctuations. Temporal distortion to make minutes feel like hours. It was, objectively speaking, absolutely brutal. Load Recruit Bennett into Chamber 4, he ordered. Standard protocol. 4-hour target duration. Medical monitoring on standby. Kayla entered the chamber willingly, because recruits did not yet understand that willingly and enthusiastically were not synonyms. She was wearing standard-issue sensor gear that would monitor her vital signs and neural activity. She had been briefed on the purpose of the exercise. She knew this was supposed to break her. She gave another one of those cheerful thumbs-up gestures to the observation camera before the door sealed. Initiating scenario. Vorn announced. All systems active. Monitoring begins now. The first hour was textbook. Kayla's heart rate elevated. Her breathing quickened. The neural activity monitors showed stress responses consistent with fear and disorientation. She moved around the chamber, trying to find walls in the darkness, calling out occasionally to see if anyone would respond. Standard behavior, predictable reactions, everything was going according to plan. The second hour was where things usually started breaking down for most recruits. Kayla's vital signs stabilized. Her heart rate dropped back to near baseline. Her breathing became slow and controlled. She is adapting, Thral'kesh observed. Neural patterns suggest she is engaging cognitive coping mechanisms. Deliberate calming techniques. Increase stimulus intensity, Thral'kesh ordered. Deploy the predator simulations. Phantom shapes began appearing in the darkness around her. Things with too many teeth, claws that scraped against invisible surfaces, breathing sounds that came from everywhere and nowhere. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in 30 seconds. Kayla's heart rate spiked briefly, then settled again. 4 hours passed. Sir, she is still stable, Plex said, checking the monitors for the 7th time. Vital signs are actually better now than when she started. I think she might be sleeping. She is not sleeping, Thral'kesh said, though he was no longer entirely certain about anything involving this particular human. Increased duration. We continue until she breaks or requests extraction. 6 hours. 8 hours. At the 10-hour mark, Vorn turned away from his monitoring station with all 3 of his eyes wide in disbelief. Sir, her neural activity patterns have changed. She is, I do not know how to describe this, she is thinking, actively. Like she is working on a complex problem. What kind of problem? Thral'kesh demanded. I have no idea, sir. But her brainwave patterns are consistent with focused analytical thought. She is not panicking. She is not even particularly stressed. She is just thinking about something. 12 hours. Thral'kesh's tentacles were twitching with anxiety. Sir, we need to pull her out. 12 hours in sensory deprivation is approaching the threshold for permanent psychological damage. We are violating safety protocols. She has not requested extraction, Thral'kesh said, though his own certainty was crumbling. The protocol states that recruits remain in the chamber until they voluntarily withdraw or exhibit signs of critical distress. Sir, with respect, the protocol was written assuming recruits would break within 4 to 6 hours, Plex said. We are now 3 times beyond the expected maximum duration. This is uncharted territory. Thral'kesh stared at the monitors, at the vital signs that showed a human who should be experiencing severe psychological trauma, and was instead apparently having a pleasant time thinking about whatever humans thought about when left alone in the dark for half a day. Extract her, he said finally. Manual override. Open the chamber. The door unsealed with a hiss of equalizing pressure. Light flooded into the chamber, revealing Kayla sitting cross-legged in the center of the floor, her sensor gear neatly arranged beside her because apparently she had taken it off at some point. Her eyes were closed. Her hands were resting on her knees in a posture that looked almost meditative. She opened her eyes, blinked a few times against the sudden light, and smiled up at Thral'kesh standing in the doorway. Oh, hey, she said, stretching her arms over her head with an audible series of pops from her spine. That was weird. How long was I in there? Felt like maybe 6 or 7 hours, but temporal perception gets really unreliable in sensory deprivation, so I am probably way off. 12 hours. Thral'kesh said, his voice flat. You were in there for 12 hours. Oh wow, Kayla said, standing up and rolling her shoulders. That is actually pretty close to my estimate then. Good to know my internal clock is still somewhat calibrated. She picked up the datapad she had apparently been issued before the exercise, tapped a few commands, and held it out to him. So I had a lot of time to think in there and I figured out that thing with the turret patterns from the Gauntlet. It is actually based on a Fibonacci sequence. Look, I worked out the math. Thral'kesh took the datapad with hands that were not entirely steady. On the screen was a detailed tactical analysis, complete with mathematical formulas, probability calculations, and a suggested counter-strategy for defeating the turret defense grid. It was thorough. It was accurate. It was the kind of analysis that should have taken a team of specialists several days to compile. She had written it in her head, in the dark, while being psychologically tortured. You spent 12 hours, he said slowly, locked in a sensory deprivation chamber specifically designed to break your mind, and you used that time to do tactical analysis homework. I mean, there was not much else to do, Kayla said, reasonably. After the first couple hours, I realized the phantom predators were not real, and the scary sounds were just audio loops on a timer, and the temperature changes followed a predictable pattern, so I figured I might as well use the time productively. Also, I worked through some personal stuff. It is really good thinking time when there are no distractions. She paused, tilting her head slightly. Am I supposed to be more traumatized? Your face suggests I am supposed to be more traumatized. Thral'kesh looked at her, then at the datapad, then back at her, then at his 3 assistants, who were staring with expressions that ranged from shock to existential confusion. Recruit Bennett, he said carefully. You are aware that the psychological warfare exercise is designed to identify mental breaking points. Yes. Yes, sir. And you are aware that most recruits experience significant psychological distress during this exercise. Yes, sir. I read the briefing materials. And yet you just decided not to break? Kayla shrugged. I mean, breaking seemed counterproductive, sir. I am here to pass the training, not to fail a psychological torture test. So I just, did not let it bother me. Humans are pretty good at that, actually. Adapting to unpleasant circumstances. We have a lot of practice. Thral'kesh was no longer baffled. He was concerned. Deeply, profoundly concerned. Dismissed, he said. Report to medical for evaluation, then get 8 hours of rest. That is an order. Yes, sir, Kayla said, giving a slightly better but still terrible salute before walking out of the chamber. The moment she was gone, Thral'kesh turned to his staff. I want a full review of her file. Every document, every test result, every single piece of data we have on her. Something is wrong. Humans do not do this. Statistically, psychologically, biologically, they do not do this. What if the file is accurate, sir? Tilka asked quietly. What if she really is just rated at 2.1 and we have fundamentally misunderstood what that means? Thral'kesh did not answer. He was too busy recalculating everything he thought he knew about acceptable combat ratings. The combat simulation arena occupied the entire eastern wing of the Predator Division compound, a space large enough to accommodate full-scale tactical scenarios, with live fire environmental hazards, and enough destructive potential to require its own dedicated medical facility. Thral'kesh stood in the control booth, watching the team assignments populate on his display screen. This was the final evaluation before the first official elimination round, which meant it was his last opportunity to identify recruits who were definitively unsuited for the program before they wasted everyone's time for another month. The exercise was straightforward. Teams of 3 recruits versus instructor-controlled combat drones in a simulated urban warfare environment. The drones were military-grade, equipped with non-lethal suppression weapons that would hurt considerably but not cause permanent damage. Probably. The medical waivers were very thorough on that point. Team composition mattered. Recruits who could not coordinate, communicate, or cooperate under pressure would fail regardless of individual skill. It was a test of tactical thinking, adaptability, and the ability to function as part of a unit rather than a solo operator, which was why Thral'kesh had very deliberately assigned Kayla Bennett to the worst possible team he could construct. Team 7, he announced over the facility-wide communication system. Recruit Bennett, Recruit Quintar, and Recruit Vorath. Report to Arena Station 3. Beside him, Plex made a small choking sound. Sir, are you certain that is the team composition you want? Absolutely certain, Thral'kesh said, pulling up the psychological profiles on his secondary monitor. Quintar has not spoken a single word to another recruit in 3 weeks. He operates exclusively as a lone assassin and has actively sabotaged 2 previous team exercises by refusing to coordinate. Vorath is a Korgathi shock trooper whose combat doctrine consists entirely of charging directly at threats while screaming. They have nothing in common, no compatible tactics, and will almost certainly hate each other within 30 seconds. And you are putting Recruit Bennett with them because I want to see what happens when she has no support, no cooperation, and no reasonable chance of success, Thral'kesh said flatly. If she fails, it confirms she has simply been lucky. If she succeeds, then we have a much larger problem to address. In the arena staging area, Kayla was checking her equipment loadout while her 2 teammates studiously ignored both her and each other. Quintar stood 15 feet away, all 4 eyes focused on the arena entrance, his body language radiating cold hostility. Vorath was practicing his war screams, which echoed off the concrete walls at a volume that probably violated several safety regulations. Kayla walked over to Quintar first, because apparently she had not yet learned that Ice World assassins preferred to be left alone. Hey, she said, falling into step beside him despite the fact that he had not acknowledged her existence. So I have been watching your movement patterns during drills and I think I have figured out your preferred engagement range. You like to initiate from 40 to 60 feet, usually from an elevated position, and you compensate for your regulator suit's weight distribution by leading with your left shoulder on aggressive advances. That is going to be predictable in close quarters combat, so maybe we should talk about how to cover that tell. Quintar turned all four eyes toward her. His expression, insofar as his species had expressions, suggested he was trying to determine if she was insane, suicidal, or both. I do not coordinate, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I work alone, you will stay out of my way and I will complete the objective. Cool, Kayla said, completely unbothered by the explicit rejection. That is actually useful information. Thanks for clarifying. She turned to Vorath, who had stopped screaming long enough to notice he had teammates. Hey, big guy. You favor frontal assault tactics, high-impact engagement, lots of noise and intimidation. That is great for drawing fire and creating openings. If you go in loud, I can provide suppression coverage from mid-range, and Quintar can flank from whatever shadow he is currently brooding in. Sound good? Vorath stared at her. You are very small, you will be crushed immediately. Probably not. But I appreciate the concern, Kayla said. Just try not to accidentally crush me and we will be fine. The arena doors opened with a mechanical groan, revealing a mock-urban environment complete with multi-story buildings, narrow alleyways, and enough cover positions to support dozens of tactical approaches. Somewhere in that maze 12 combat drones were waiting to eliminate them. Begin simulation, Thral'kesh's voice echoed through the arena. You have 20 minutes to reach the extraction point. Drones are active. Good luck. Vorath immediately charged forward with a roar that shook dust from the ceiling, because Korgathi's shock troopers had exactly one tactical setting, and it was loud and direct. Quintar vanished into the shadows along the left flank without a word, because Iceworld assassins had exactly one tactical setting and it was silent and alone. Kayla stood at the entrance for approximately 3 seconds, watching both teammates disappear in opposite directions, then sprinted straight up the center lane while talking to herself. Okay. So we are doing this with no coordination. That is fine. Totally fine. This is what tactical improvisation looks like. In the control booth, Thral'kesh leaned forward, watching her movement pattern. She was not taking cover. She was not advancing cautiously. She was running directly into the most exposed position in the entire arena while her teammates operated independently on opposite flanks. Sir, should we be concerned that she appears to have no actual plan? Vorn asked. She always has a plan, Thral'kesh muttered. I just have no idea what it is. The first drones appeared, rising from concealed positions on the rooftops. Their targeting systems acquired locks immediately. Kayla was the most exposed target, running alone up the center of the street with minimal cover. They fired. Kayla hit the ground in a slide, momentum carrying her under the suppression fire, then rolled left behind a concrete barrier as the drones adjusted their aim. She popped up, fired 3 shots at the nearest drone, not to destroy it but to force it to reposition, then sprinted to the next cover point. She is using herself as bait, Tilka said, watching the tactical overlay. She is drawing fire away from her teammates' approach vectors. That is tactically insane, Plex said. She is going to get eliminated in the first 2 minutes, except she was not getting eliminated. She was moving between cover points with precision timing, always staying just ahead of the drone targeting solutions, firing just enough to keep their attention without committing to sustained engagement. She was not trying to win. She was trying to create space. On the left flank, Quintar reached an elevated position and began systematically eliminating drones with the cold efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times. On the right, Vorath crashed through a wall, because apparently doors were for species without natural battering ram capabilities, and started smashing drones with his bare hands while screaming about honor. Kayla kept moving up the center, coordinating nothing, communicating with no one, and somehow maintaining a tactical rhythm that kept the entire team's engagement lanes clear. Then Quintar made a mistake. He spotted a cluster of 3 drones in a courtyard, and without reconnaissance or support dropped from his perch and charged in alone. It was aggressive. It was fast. It was also exactly what the combat simulation AI had been programmed to exploit. The drones repositioned instantly, surrounding him in a crossfire pattern that cut off all retreat angles. Quintar realized his error half a second too late, his thermal regulator sparking as suppression rounds hit from 3 directions simultaneously. In the control booth, Thral'kesh pulled up the elimination probability calculator. Quintar is pinned, 87% chance of elimination in the next 15 seconds. Except Kayla was already moving. She had been 40 feet away, engaged with her own drone. But the moment Quintar committed to his attack, she broke off and sprinted toward his position. She did not call out. She did not signal. She just moved, like she had known exactly where he would be, and exactly when he would overextend. She cleared the corner, dropped to one knee, and laid down suppression fire that forced 2 of the 3 drones to reposition. It was not enough to destroy them, but it was enough to break their crossfire pattern. And that was all Quintar needed. He rolled left, came up with both primary weapons drawn, and eliminated all 3 drones in a sequence that took less than 4 seconds. The team reached the extraction point with 2 minutes to spare. 0 eliminations. Perfect score. In the staging area after the simulation, Quintar approached Kayla while she was cleaning her weapon. He stood there for approximately 10 seconds, silent, until she looked up. "How did you know where I would be?" he asked, his voice still barely above a whisper but carrying actual curiosity instead of hostility. Kayla set down her weapon and looked at him with those disturbingly observant brown eyes. "You always lead with your left shoulder when you are angry," she said, matter-of-factly. "Makes you predictable. You also favor elevated positions between 40 and 60 feet, and when you spot multiple targets clustered together, you commit without checking for trap configurations because your training emphasizes speed over caution. So when I saw those 3 drones positioned in a courtyard with clear sightlines from your approach vector, I knew you would go for them, and I knew you would get pinned, so I positioned myself to provide support." Quintar stared at her. "You have been watching me?" "I have been watching everyone," Kayla said, picking her weapon back up. "Since day 1, you lead with your left shoulder. Lorath always screams 3 seconds before he charges, which telegraphs his attacks. Zorail overcompensates with his lower arms when he is tired. The Drexian twins have a 0.2-second delay in their telepathic coordination when they are stressed. Everyone has patterns. You just have to pay attention." She smiled, friendly, and completely unbothered by the fact that she had just admitted to psychologically profiling every single recruit in the program. "You are either incredibly intelligent or incredibly dangerous," Quintar said slowly. "Can't I be both?" Kayla asked. In the control booth, Thral'kesh closed the team evaluation files and leaned back in his chair. His mandibles were clicking together in a rhythm that his staff had learned to associate with deep existential frustration. "Sir," Tilka asked carefully, "your assessment." "She has been profiling everyone," Thral'kesh said quietly. "From day 1, every recruit, every movement pattern, every psychological tell. She has been building a tactical database in her head while everyone else was just trying to survive." That is actually remarkable, sir," Plex offered. "That level of observational analysis usually takes years of combat experience to develop." "She is 19 years old," Thral'kesh said. "She should not have years of combat experience. She should barely have years of anything." He pulled up her file one more time, staring at the combat rating that still impossibly read 2.1. "Find out who processed her application," he ordered. "Find out who approved her scores. Find out everything, because that rating is either the biggest clerical error in Coalition history, or someone is lying to me and I am very tired of not knowing which." Thral'kesh's office was designed to be intimidating. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the training grounds. Walls lined with commendations, battle honors and weapons from 36 campaigns. A desk made from salvaged hull plating from his first command. Everything in the room was calculated to remind visitors that they were in the presence of someone who had earned their authority through 2 centuries of violence. Kayla walked in like she was attending a scheduled career counseling session, datapad in hand, posture relaxed. "Recruit Bennett," Thral'kesh said, not bothering with pleasantries. "Sit." She sat, setting her datapad on her lap and looking at him with polite attention. Thral'kesh pulled up her file on his primary display, rotating the screen so she could see it clearly. The personnel record, the test scores, the evaluation metrics, and there highlighted in red because he had marked it personally, the combat rating, 2.1. "I am going to ask you a question," he said slowly. and I would appreciate an honest answer. How are you doing this? Kayla looked at the screen, then at him, then back at the screen. Her expression shifted slightly, and then she started laughing. Not a polite chuckle, not a nervous giggle. A full, genuine, uncontrolled laugh that went on for at least 30 seconds, possibly 45, while Thral'kesh sat behind his desk trying to determine if he was being mocked or if she had finally suffered a complete psychological break. I am sorry, she said, wiping her eyes and still grinning. I am so sorry. It is just, you really did not know. This whole time. Oh, that is amazing. That makes this so much better. Explain, Thral'kesh said flatly. Now, Kayla took a breath, composing herself. Okay, so, that rating, the 2.1, I knew about it from day one. It was on my acceptance letter. Big, official coalition letterhead. Very professional, complete with a typo that made me statistically less dangerous than a houseplant. Thral'kesh's mandibles stopped moving entirely. You knew? Of course I knew, Kayla said. Like this was obvious. I saw it the moment I opened the letter. Combat rating 2.1. I actually called the processing center to ask if it was a mistake. They put me on hold for 40 minutes, and then someone came back and said, and I quote, if it is in the system it is correct. Report for training is scheduled. So I figured, you know what? I am not going to argue. You deliberately. Thral'kesh felt his translator struggling to find appropriate words and standard. You knowingly accepted placement in the most elite training program in the coalition based on a clerical error. Well, yeah, Kayla said. Because here is the thing. I did my research before applying. I knew Predator Division had a 93% washout rate. I knew it was designed for species with significant genetic advantages. I also knew that humans had never not once been accepted into the program. Every human applicant gets screened out during preliminary review. Always. 100% rejection rate. She leaned forward slightly, her expression shifting from amused to serious. So I ran the numbers, she continued. If I applied legitimately with my actual scores, I would get rejected. Not because I was unqualified, but because I was human. And your screening algorithms are biased toward species with obvious physical advantages. Armor, redundant organs, enhanced strength, all that stuff. Humans do not check those boxes, so the system does not even look at the rest of our qualifications. That is, the screening process is designed to identify optimal candidates based on statistical survival probability, Thral'kesh said, though he was no longer entirely certain he believed his own words. It is not bias. It is mathematics. Lech's mathematics built on assumptions, Kayla countered. And one of those assumptions is that humans are not worth the investment, so I needed to bypass the assumptions. And the easiest way to bypass an algorithm is to give it data that does not fit its parameters. A 2.1 rating. That is so far outside normal range that it becomes an edge case. Edge cases get processed differently. They require manual review. Manual review by whom? Thral'kesh demanded. By someone in your administrative department who was probably very bored, very tired, and absolutely not paid enough to care about a single low-priority application, Kayla said. Someone who looked at the paperwork, saw that all the forms were filled out correctly, saw that I had technically met the minimum requirements, and just clicked approve without reading the actual numbers. Because why would they? It is just paperwork. Thral'kesh stared at her. You deliberately lowballed your qualifications, knowing it would create a clerical error, banking on the assumption that someone would process your application without actually reading it. Yes, Kayla said simply. Because a clerical error is not a bias. It is just a mistake. And mistakes get through. Humans always get rejected on purpose. But I figured maybe, just maybe, I could get accepted by accident. That is, Thral'kesh's translator made a sound that did not have an equivalent in any language. That is insane. Maybe, Kayla agreed, but it worked. So here I am. Thral'kesh leaned back in his chair, processing this information. You manipulated the system. You lied on your application. I did not lie, Kayla said firmly. Every piece of information I submitted was technically accurate. I just selectively presented it in a way that would maximize my chances of slipping through the cracks. That is not lying. That is strategy. Why? Thral'kesh asked. And for the first time since this conversation started, he was not asking as a commander interrogating a subordinate. He was asking as someone who genuinely did not understand. Why go through all this? Why take this risk? You could have applied to a dozen other programs. Legitimate programs. Programs that would have accepted you without requiring you to sabotage your own application. Kayla was quiet for a moment, looking out the window at the training grounds below, where recruits were running drills under the supervision of instructors who were actively trying to make them fail. Because everyone keeps telling humanity what we cannot do, she said finally. We are too fragile, too emotional, too short-lived. We do not have armor. We do not have redundant organs. We do not have natural weapons. We are not designed for this. We are not built for combat. We should stay in support roles, logistics, analysis, anything that keeps us away from actual danger. She turned back to face him, and her expression was calm, but there was something fierce behind it. I wanted to see what happened if I just did it anyway, she said. Not because I had permission, not because the system said I was qualified, just because I decided to. Humans are really good at that actually. Doing things we are not supposed to be able to do. We have been doing it for our entire history. We walked out of our caves when we were not ready. We built cities when we did not have the technology. We went to space when everyone said it was impossible. We do not wait for permission. We just go. She smiled slightly. So I went, and here we are. Thral'kesh looked at her. This small human who had systematically dismantled every assumption he had made about species capability, statistical probability, and the reliability of administrative screening processes. You realize, he said slowly, that I could have you expelled immediately for falsifying your application. You could, Kayla agreed. But you would have to admit that your screening process was broken enough to let me through in the first place, and that your training program, designed to break the toughest warriors in the galaxy, could not break one human with a 2.1 rating. That would be embarrassing. For you. Publicly. She was not threatening him. She was just stating facts. Thral'kesh's mandibles clicked together in what might have been frustration, or respect, or possibly both. Get out of my office, he said. You have drills in 20 minutes. Do not be late. Kayla stood, picked up her datapad, and gave one of her still terrible salutes. Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. She made it to the door before he stopped her. Bennett. She turned. Sir? Your actual rating, he said. The real one. What is it? Kayla grinned. You are the expert, sir. You tell me. She left. Thral'kesh sat in his office for a long time after she was gone, staring at the file that somehow contained both everything and nothing about who Kayla Bennett actually was. Then he pulled up the screening algorithm parameters and started making notes on what needed to change. Because if one human could game the system this effectively, there were probably others out there waiting to do the same thing. And he was absolutely not prepared for that. 6 weeks after the confrontation in his office, Commander Thral'kesh stood at his observation deck watching Kayla Bennett lead a tactical coordination drill with a mixed squad of recruits who had initially refused to work with her. She was ranked 4th in her class. 4th, out of 43 remaining recruits drawn from species that evolution had specifically designed for violence. The Galactic military forums had, predictably, lost their collective minds. Threads with titles like Human Infiltrates Predator Division through Clerical Error and 2.1 rating achieves 4th place system broken, had accumulated thousands of responses in multiple languages, most of which questioned either the legitimacy of the program, the competence of coalition screening processes, or the fundamental laws of physics. Thral'kesh had received no fewer than 17 official inquiries from Coalition Command, all politely phrased but essentially asking the same question. What in the name of every war god across known space was happening in his training facility? His response had been carefully crafted. The paperwork was correct, just not in the way we expected. Recruit Bennett met all technical requirements for admission and has performed within acceptable parameters for continuation. No violations of protocol have occurred. It was, technically true. It was also completely inadequate, as an explanation, which was exactly the point. Let them wonder. Let them investigate. Let them try to figure out how a human with a statistically impossible rating had not only survived but thrived in a program designed to break warriors twice her size and 3 times her natural lifespan. He had already started quietly revising the screening algorithms, removing some of the species preference weighting, adding new evaluation criteria that measured adaptability, pattern recognition, and psychological resilience rather than just raw physical capability. The changes would take months to implement properly, and he was doing it all under the administrative radar, because he absolutely did not want to explain to his superiors why he was redesigning a 200-year-old system based on the performance of one human who had gamed her way in through a decimal point error, because that was the thing keeping him awake during his rest cycles. If one human, operating alone with no support and no legitimate pathway to entry, could do this, what happened when humans started applying legitimately? What happened when they showed up with proper scores, proper documentation, and the full backing of their species' military command? What happened when humanity stopped asking for permission and just decided to take what they wanted? On the training ground below, Kayla was explaining a flanking maneuver to Zara, who was listening with what appeared to be genuine respect. Quintar stood nearby, no longer maintaining his usual isolation distance. Even Vorath had stopped referring to her as small breakable thing and had upgraded her designation to small dangerous thing, which for a Korgathi shock trooper was practically a term of endearment. She had done something Thral'kesh had not seen in 3 decades of running this program. She had fundamentally changed how the other recruits thought about capability. They no longer assumed that physical advantages translated directly to tactical superiority. They had learned, through repeated demonstration, that the smallest member of their unit was often the most dangerous, not despite her limitations, but because she had spent her entire life learning to compensate for them. Thral'kesh pulled out his datapad, the same one he used for official evaluation notes, and started writing. Not an evaluation, not a report, just observations, things he had noticed, patterns in how humans approached problems differently, ways they used creativity and unpredictability as weapons when they lacked traditional advantages, methods for turning perceived weaknesses into tactical options. He was taking notes. The student had become the teacher, and Commander Thral'kesh, 247 years old, veteran of campaigns across a dozen sectors, architect of the most elite training program in the Coalition, was learning that maybe, just maybe, his assumptions about optimal warrior genetics had been incomplete, learning that adaptability might be more valuable than armor, learning that sometimes the most dangerous thing you could face was not the biggest predator in the room, but the smallest one who had spent her entire life figuring out how to win anyway. Kayla finished her explanation, and the squad moved into position to run the drill. She glanced up at the observation deck, seemed to spot him watching, and gave one of her characteristic thumbs-up gestures. Thral'kesh did not return the gesture, because that would be unprofessional, but his mandibles curved slightly in what might, in certain light, have been mistaken for approval. Somewhere out there in human space, there were probably thousands more like her, people who had been told they were not good enough, not strong enough, not built right for the roles they wanted, people who had been rejected by systems that could not measure what actually mattered. And now one of them had proven that the system was wrong. He had a feeling the next few decades of galactic military operations were going to be very, very interesting, and possibly extremely inconvenient for anyone who had gotten comfortable underestimating humanity. Thral'kesh closed his datapad, filed his observations in a secured folder marked ongoing research, and went back to watching his recruits train. The paperwork had been correct after all, just not in any way the system had anticipated, which he was beginning to suspect was going to be humanity's signature move for the foreseeable future. The end.